this was a forest wildlife habitat assessment lab. And it was a combination of assessing deer winter habitat and assessing forest bird habitat. And we would do a bunch of data collection today and assess deer habitat, and we do the bird part. You're going to still do the bird part, but you'll just do that separately on your own. So this was originally kind of a little more cohesive lab in that regard in terms of habitat assessment. But what we're going to do instead of the data collection for the deer part is we'll just talk about the ideas that we would be trying to capture with the data collection. And so let me know if you have questions as we go through this. And we're also going to talk about gaps a little bit. So we're going to kind of wander around and we'll kind of talk about deer habitat intermixed with gaps as we roam a little bit. Okay, so let's start off by talking about deer. And start off by talking about, well, before we dive deeply into deer winter habitat, where are we in the range of white-tailed deer? What was that?
We're like on the northern end of it.
Yeah, we're kind of up on the northern fringes. So we're kind of at the limits of their northern range. They do go a little farther north into Canada a little bit, but their densities are very low as you start going up into Canada north of the Maine border. And so winter habitat is very important, especially because deer are not very, they're not terribly well adapted for winter conditions. They don't handle a lot of snow well, unlike moose. Moose does much better in deep snow than deer do. They're also bigger bodied, so they have an easier time staying warm as well as a larger bodied animal than deer do. So moose are just kind of better adapted for northern climates than deer are. So as a consequence of that, winter habitat's really important. So this time of year, so fall going into winter is a really important part of deer survival in the wintertime, because this is the time of year when they're putting on fat, right? So they're eating as much as they can. They're eating acorns and other hard mast and whatever else they can find. What else do they eat? What kind of foods do they normally eat? Young vegetation. What kind of young vegetation? Newer tree growth. So woody vegetation is a big part of it. They are browsers. Browsers eat woody vegetation, particularly twigs and broadleaf, broad leaves part of the vegetation. They do eat herbaceous vegetation as well. They do not eat a lot of grass. What are animals called that eat lots of grasses? Graminoids. What kind of feeding strategy is that if you're a mammal? Those are grazers. So those are your bison and your cows and that kind of thing. They're grazers. They eat grass, graminoids. Deer are browsers. They eat broadleaf vegetation, primarily woody vegetation. So from kind of late spring to early fall, they have plenty of that, right? But what do they have to eat now as they're going into winter? What's their food? What food do they have available to them? Evergreens. Yeah, so the only thing that has leaves left on them. Or just the woody twigs, right? They could eat the woody twigs on the deciduous vegetation. That's an option. And so they can eat that. Do woody twigs have very high nutritional value? No, they're pretty low in caloric value. So for deer to make it through the winter, they're relying on that fat reserve, because during the winter, there's not a lot of calories for them to eat in the woods. So they'll eat things, but it's gonna not have a lot of calories in it. It's mostly filler. It's mostly just to kind of make them feel less hungry than it is to actually give them any sort of caloric boost during the winter time. So that is why you have a lot of deer die-offs in the springtime, like March and April, before you get green up, because they've run out of fat reserves and they don't have anything of high caloric value to eat yet at that point in time. So that's where you start seeing starvation, late winter, early spring for deer. So what is their other strategy? What else can they do to help make it through the winter? So if they can't eat their way through the winter, what's their other option? How else do you conserve calories? Hibernate. You could hibernate. Deer are not hibernators though, but that is a strategy that some animals take. Some animals migrate. They just get the heck out of Dodge and go somewhere where there's more food. But deer don't. Well, deer do migrate, and they will move to areas with better winter resources. Some deer are migratory, some are not. What's your other strategy? How else can you conserve calories? That, or what you do is you find shelter where you can be a little bit warmer, stay out of the wind, stay out of the deep snow to conserve the fat that you have, right? So that you aren't demanding a lot of calories, right? So if you can conserve energy, you can hold on to your fat longer, right? So deer winter habitat in the northern limits tend to be softwood dominated, a lot of softwoods, and they tend to be pretty dense, closed canopy for the most part. Why softwoods? Why aren't they out in the middle of hardwood stands all winter? Why do they go into softwoods? What are the
Coverage.
What was that?
More coverage.
More coverage of what?
Little leaves.
Yeah, so why is that important? Why is that cover important?
Help guard from the snow.
So it helps guard from the snow. So what's happening to the snow? It's still falling from the sky, right? So what's happening with the softwoods that's different than hardwoods? They're catching the snow. They're intercepting the snow and keeping it from falling on the ground. So if you're in a dense softwood stand, you've probably noticed that the snow depth is lower, right? And once deer start dragging their belly in the snow, they really have trouble getting around. So when you've got deep snow conditions, they try to find places where the snow depth is less, or where their sinking snow depth is less, where they're not sinking in as much. So if you've ever been in a dense hemlock, cedar, spruce, fir stand, you've probably noticed it's much easier to walk around yourself, right? Suddenly the snow is much less. So that's what they're partly looking for, is that. One is shallower snow. What's the other thing that dense softwoods provide in the winter? So we've got the less snow. Ooh, I definitely can't hear you, Owen. Insulation, perfect. So it's protection from the wind and the cold temperatures. The more open the environment is, the more the temperatures fluctuate during the course of the day. So it gets really cold at night and it gets really warm in the day. But if you're in a dense softwood stand, it's more moderated. You don't have, it stays cooler on the upper end and it's warmer on the lower end, right? So it provides thermal cover. We call that thermal cover. And it also helps block the wind. So your wind chill, it doesn't go down as much in there as well. So it's less snow and warmer and protected from the wind. So those are the things that they're looking for. And that helps them stay a little bit warmer. They're able to move around a little easier and it allows them to conserve that fat. That's really valuable for them because they have to rely on that for the whole winter. And the snowier, colder you are, usually the longer your winter is. So you need to stretch your fat even further the harsher the winter climate is. So, all right. So now we've established why this kind of habitat's really important. So let's talk a little bit about, well, actually, before we go on, so based on this, do you think deer winter habitat is equally important across the state, especially deer yards? So what I'm talking about are places where deer gather, deer winter areas, or deer yards specifically. Those are the places where they congregate to stay out of the elements. So do you think it's equally important for that habitat to be there across the state of Maine, for example? Yes. Is it equally important to have that in, say, Brunswick as it is in Fort Kent? Are the winter conditions the same in those two places? No. What's different? A lot more snow, and for a much longer part of the winter, so it's a longer duration. It's also colder. Brunswick's on the coast. It has more moderate temperatures than inland. So, do you think deer winter habitat is equally important across the state based on this? Probably not, because in the more southern eastern parts of the state, where it's milder and where there isn't very much snow, relatively speaking, they may not really need very high quality deer winter habitat because it's never really that bad, or it is just periodically, right? You get a nor'easter and maybe that snow kind of melts, and then it's not so bad. Or it gets icy enough that they just don't sink into it anymore. You know, a lot of the coastal snow can be kind of packed and icy, you've probably noticed, so they don't sink in so much. So it's probably more important to have good winter habitat in the northern and western part of the state where there's a lot more snow, the duration of snow is much longer, and where temperatures tend to be colder. So it's more important there. And the farther south you go, basically there's really not much of, you know, in terms of winter shelter anyway, winter shelter becomes not very important the farther south you go, because they don't, you know, there's just no snow eventually, right? Or when you get 2 inches of snow, that's not enough to be a problem for the deer. Might be a problem for humans, but not for the deer. Okay, so let's see. So in terms of deer wintering areas, deer wintering areas in the state have been studied for a very long time, probably since, you know, it's been known that they've been very important for, you know, 80 years probably. And that's because deer populations really tanked early in the 1900s throughout much of their range. In fact, some states even stopped hunting deer. Deer were really rare in some places. And we're actually really worried about whether we were going to continue to have deer populations at one point in some places. So, deer hunting regulations were put in place to protect deer populations so that we wouldn't over-harvest them. And deer numbers started increasing a little bit. Do you think deer densities or deer distribution has always been like it is now in the state of Maine? What's different about where deer are now versus, say, 150 years ago? Yep, there are definitely more deer in some of the more developed areas, especially agricultural areas where they're getting supplemental food by eating crops, right? What about in the north? I'm sorry, this truck. More of an expansion. And that's true. Deer densities in the north and the west were at one point almost non-existent. And then they really, not only they expanded, but densities went way up. What caused densities to go way up in the north and the western parts of the state? Well, is there a lack of predators? Actually, historically, what was their primary predator other than humans? It was wolves, yep. What is their primary predator now? Was it?
Humans?
Well, other than humans. Of other four-legged things. What was that? Black bears do. They eat fawns in particular. That's one of their predators. Bobcats, also a fawn predator. What about adult, larger deer? What's their primary predator in the state? Obviously not wolves anymore. What was that? Oh, what'd you say? Coyotes. Coyotes are their primary predator now. So, what's the history of coyotes in the state of Maine? Were there coyotes here 300 years ago? Actually, are coyotes native to the state of Maine? No. They are not an eastern predator. They have also expanded their range considerably. They're considered a prairie species that have greatly expanded their range, especially to the east. So So deer historically here didn't have to deal with coyotes as predators, they dealt with wolves. And so we've kind of supplemented our predator base a little bit. Obviously bears and bobcats and lynx and those kinds of critters have always been here, but the coyote wolf complex is very different than what it used to be. Actually, I kind of wonder, like, we have some really big coyotes out here. You know, I know there's some hybridization stuff going on as well, but I almost kind of wonder if the coyotes aren't getting bigger to take kind of more of a wolf niche, right? To be able to take down deer. It's not an easy thing to take down an adult deer, but the bigger the coyote is, the better its chances are of taking a large animal, right? So I almost wonder if we don't have selective pressure towards larger coyotes as a consequence of that. In parts of the world where there's wolves, the coyotes and the wolves are competing with one another, and the wolves will kill coyotes in their territories. So you have a whole different dynamic where you have both species present. So that kind of changes things a bit. But so here it's coyotes kind of year-round, and then you've got the spring-summer predation on fawns by bobcat and bears, and perhaps occasionally a lynx might take a fawn, I bet. So anyway, so we've got this changing dynamic in predators. So that has changed a little bit in the state. So that's part of the story. What else may have caused deer, though, to increase greatly, especially 40, 50 years ago in particular? There was a major event in the state that greatly changed forests. Spruce budworm outbreak. Absolutely. So with the spruce budworm outbreak, we had large, vast areas of fir spruce stands that were defoliated and killed. And so the companies that owned those lands were going in and doing salvaging. They were trying to salvage as much of that lumber as they could. And so they clear cut really large areas in order to try to, make the most out of what they could salvage from their lands. So in response to that, we had a big burst of regeneration across the landscape. And suddenly, if you're deer, you have all this food that's like down at your level, right? So you've moved the food from being up in the canopy to being down near the ground where they can reach it. So the deer population really responded to that. And so we saw deer expansion and densities increase in response to that. So what's been the pattern since then? Have we maintained those same levels of deer densities in the north and the west where we had spruce budworm outbreaks?
Has it slowly declined over time?
I think it's slowly declined over time, and that makes sense because those forests are maturing. I mean, obviously there's still a lot of timber harvesting going on, which helps maintain some kind of minimum density levels, but it's not like it used to be. So there's not like thousands of acres of just even age, everything the same age, right? So basically what we did with the spruce budworm outbreak is we raised the carrying capacity, right? Because there was just bonanza food, but with time the carrying capacity has come down, and so the deer populations responded by being lower and having lower densities, much to the dismay of hunters, right? Because there's lots of people that like to hunt deer and like to see certain minimum levels of deer around so that they can continue to hunt them. So anyway, so there's some conflicting processes there, but anyway, so part of the concern with the dropping deer densities was also like, how do we hold on to those deer? Like, how do we keep them around, right? And so winter habitat became a big concern, and loss of winter habitat. So the state decided that it needed to do more to protect these deer yards, because without them, the deer just don't survive, especially in these harsh areas. Most deer die in the winter, and especially fawns. That's where a lot of fawns weren't making it, because they're smaller, right? They're smaller bodied, they can't put on as much fat. A lot of the fawns weren't making it through the winter. So they decided they needed to protect deer habitat in the state. So they enacted zoning to protect those areas. So they're called PFWs. So I think it stands for Protected Fish and Wildlife Habitat in the state. And it isn't just for deer, but it also protects fish habitat, for Atlantic salmon and brook trout. And this is actual land use zoning. So much like where you live might be zoned residential, or McDonald's is zoned commercial, or some places are zoned industrial. There's all these different types of zoning, right? This is actually a zoned deer yard in this situation. And this was enacted back in the 60s and 70s. So the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife conducted all these surveys. They did aerial surveys, they did ground surveys to find all these deer wintering areas around the state that they thought were important. And so many of them, particularly in the unorganized towns of the state, were zoned. And as you can imagine, that might be a little dismaying if you're a landowner, right? Because suddenly you've got new zoning that is restrictive in terms of what you can do with your management there. Because there were specific guidelines that now you had to follow once you had these zoned areas on your property. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that is. But as you can imagine, through time, having restrictions placed on landowners did not necessarily go over well. Yeah.
You know if those were like an immediate, like as soon as the bill was signed, you couldn't do anything, or was it like a gradual thing?
I think it was a little bit gradual, and it certainly wasn't that you can't do anything. So the procedure is that in order to harvest in these zoned areas, so they're delineated, and you can go on the state website now and download the shape files. You can see right where they all are. It restricted your activities in there, but it didn't mean you couldn't do anything. It's just that you had to come up with a management plan that had to be approved by an IF&W regional biologist. They had to approve your harvest plan or management plan, your management plan and then the harvest plan, before you did anything. And the idea was that you were going to maintain certain characteristics on that, within that polygon, at different points in time. So as a forester, suddenly now you've got more steps if you are planning to do a timber harvest. So, I mean, most landowners or companies had a management plan, but they didn't have to have it approved by a state agency necessarily. So this was extra hoops to jump through. So you had to develop a plan, you had to have it reviewed by a biologist. They might have you tweak or change things in your plan. So you're going through iterations, so you're coming up with different management strategies. You might be changing your economic analysis of what that means, like if you have to change your silvicultural system that you're using, or how much area you're allowed to harvest. That's all going to change your economic kind of forecasting of costs and profits that you're going to be able to get. So every time there's changes, you have to kind of like redo all your math for these sites. And so as you can imagine, that's time consuming, and that's money, right? You're paying your forester to put all this time in to getting this plan worked out with the state and getting it signed off on. So that's all additional resources that landowners then have to come up with in order to go through that process. So, not necessarily very popular, right? Because this is taking more time and it's taking more money in order to meet these guidelines. So in response to that, the state came up with a different process for working with landowners to protect this habitat. And it was through cooperative agreements, which were voluntary. And through that, so if you got an approved cooperative agreement, it still had a management plan, but it just kind of laid out the guidelines you're going to follow, generally speaking. And as long as you continue to follow those guidelines, you don't have to have every little thing approved necessarily. And it's less restrictive. It's not zoned now. Now it's just a written agreement between you and the state that you're agreeing to co-manage these things in a certain way, right? These resources. So that's been the trend since then. So we really haven't added zoned areas, but we've added a huge amount of cooperative agreement land area that is trying to protect these areas. So the state's gone through a lot of trouble to protect this habitat. So the downside of all of this has been that a lot of these deer wintering areas are being abandoned though. So they've gone to all this effort to protect them, but now a lot of them are being abandoned. Why? What are your hypotheses as to why these places are no longer being occupied? Gone to all this trouble to protect them. It could be population decline. That could be one hypothesis. Just not enough deer to occupy them anymore. That's one possibility. What are some other hypotheses?
Predators are coming in on this area.
Say that again, sorry.
Predators are coming in on this area.
Yeah, maybe the predators are figuring out where they are. Although I'd say predators are probably always figured out where deer aggregate in the winter time. So, but maybe there's some difference in the dynamic there that we don't fully understand. What else?
Reduced all the vegetation there?
What was that?
They've reduced all the vegetation.
Yeah, maybe the quality of those deer yards has gone down. So maybe, and there's different ways that can happen. We haven't talked about all the criteria yet, but so it could be that the quality has been reduced. So that's one thought. What else?
Changing composition of the yard.
Which would result in a change in quality, like if it was shifting more towards hardwoods or something. Yep. So there might be that shift that's causing a change in quality. What else?
There'd be too many deer now, so they're like, we just don't need to manage this anymore.
Although that doesn't change the response to weather. That should mean there's more occupancy of some of these deer wintering areas if there's more deer, right? They need to go somewhere. Unless I'm not understanding your logic.
I was just thinking more just like the managed areas, like specifically protecting them for deer being abandoned just because we don't need to manage it as much anymore.
The deer are abandoning, not the people.
Yeah.
The deer are abandoning it. Yeah. The people are still around. It's the deer that are not using the deer yards anymore. They're abandoning the deer yards. Owen? Changing climate? Like maybe it's just not as harsh anymore. Maybe they just don't need this sort of habitat as much as they used to. That's a possibility. Yep. What else? We're missing a big one that's really changed deer behavior a lot in a lot of places, not just in Maine. Weather, that would kind of generally start to affect the climate conditions. So that kind of is in there in terms of need. What? Ticks? Probably not ticks. Ticks are a bigger problem for moose than they are for deer. Yep, deer groom off ticks, whereas moose don't. Moose just somehow blithely are oblivious to the ticks that are crawling all over them. But don't know why, but behaviorally they're very different in how they cope with ticks. But what else has changed? This is a human related factor. Oh, diseases, yeah. So definitely diseases are a problem in certain places. What makes disease more prevalent? There's something we like to do as humans that really increases disease risk. What was that?
Higher population.
Yeah, where do we like to really increase populations really high in the wintertime? What was that?
No, I don't know.
Years in particular, that we've really shifted our behavior and how we interact with deer, and that we feed them quite a bit, and a lot in some places. Like people will bring in truckloads of food in places. I mean, I know farmers that bring in hay bales every week and drop them off for the deer. So, they spend thousands of dollars on feeding deer, landowners, including landowners in Maine. You've maybe seen pictures. They'll show little piles of corn all up and down their driveway, and there's 100 deer in their driveway. So there's certain problems with that. We mentioned disease is one, so you increase transmission of disease when you do that. What other downsides are there?
Don't they tend to forget where their original wintering
Ah, so maybe that's a hypothesis as to why they're not using their deer yards. They're not in their deer yards because they're in people's driveways eating piles of corn, right? So, because people like to watch them and because they feel like they need to help them survive the winter.
I have elderly neighbors that do that in the summer.
Yeah, a lot of people will say that they are feeding the deer so that they survive the winter. It's like they think they're feeding them survival food. It's like why you put out bird feeders in the winter, right? Help the birds through the winter. But, you know, if that were the case, then people wouldn't do it in their backyards. So I think it's as much about watching the deer as it is about actually helping the deer in their minds. So, I mean, if you just wanted to feed the deer, you wouldn't need to do it in your yard. You could go a quarter mile back in the woods and feed them, right? But that's not what people do. They put the food in their yard. So anyway, so we've got increased transmission risk. We have potential abandonment of deer yards. What other problems do we have with deer feeding? What other issues? Road accidents. So if you're putting the food in your yard and you're next to the highway, there's places like that where deer are just constantly hit by cars over and over and over again because they're coming into food and they're crossing the highway to get to John Smith's, you know, food pile. So they're always getting KO'd in certain crossings. So they got that issue. We got predators. Predators aren't stupid. They figure out where the deer are. So suddenly now you've got predators hanging out in your yard, right? Because the coyotes and the wolves, they figure it out. They go where the food is. You know, so some people are uncomfortable with having those predators like right by your house or near your livestock if you're a farmer, right? And you're bringing in deer. So you're creating conflicts. So there's issues of deer health. The deer fight. So you start getting into issues of fighting because they have hierarchies, dominance hierarchies in deer. So you've got health issues. You've got changes in terms of ecological interactions. You've got, you know, mortality and, you know, risk to humans by running into deer. You know, so there's all sorts of problems with feeding deer. So don't want to encourage it. But getting back to the deer wintering area hypothesis, that is a big one. And we actually think that might be one of the main drivers why deer yards are being abandoned. So is that a problem? I guess that's the next thing. Is there a problem with them abandoning deer yards? I mean, because what they're going to do is they're going to stay where the food is, right? So what happens when that nor'easter comes through and we get 3.5 feet of snow? Then what do? They stay in the yard. And is the yard the best shelter that they have? A lot of times it's not. So now we're putting them at risk because they don't have a good place to go. And they start to lose the memories of where to go. How do deer learn where the deer yards are?
Their parents go to the deer
They learn from mom. Mom teaches you where the deer yards are. So you follow mom around. She shows you where they are. And, you know, so it's perpetuated that way. But if mom stops going to the deer yards and sits in John Smith's yard all winter long, then all you know is that John Smith is the place to be, right? His house, their house is where the food is. That's where we go in the wintertime. So when you do have a really bad weather event, they don't know where to go for good shelter. And maybe some of them find it again. I mean, they were moving around, so by random chance they might find some of these again. But a lot of them have been abandoned for a long time, and we're trying to figure out why. Why is that? And we don't know the consequences of that. You know, so are deer dying because, you know, now they don't have a good place to go when the weather is really severe, or not? Or maybe they're fine in John Smith's yard. Maybe they make it because now they have extra calories or whatnot, but there's still exposure problems. So anyway, so deer winter habitat is kind of a controversial issue, particularly in Maine, as a consequence. So let's talk a little bit more about the criteria. And you have a handout here that I gave you. This is pages 4 and 5 of Maine's Deer Wintering Area Management Guideline document. And the whole document is on Brightspace in our lab folder for this lab. So if you want to look at the full guidelines, You have that document. It's also on the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife website. And so these guidelines were actually developed by biologists, but do inland fisheries and wildlife have authority over deer habitat in the state? Do they have the authority to manage this habitat, do you think?
State or U.S.?
What was that? In Maine, in the state of Maine. So is the state wildlife agency, does it have authority over habitat? What do most biologists manage in the state in terms of its populations?
Yeah.
They regulate hunting seasons and that kind of thing. They don't regulate the habitat. So the habitat in the unorganized towns is actually overseen by the Land Use Planning Commission. They are the ones with the authority over the zoning. And then in the organized towns, part of the state, so more in the southern part of the state, a different agency has authority over that habitat. That's Department of Environmental Protection. It's very confusing. There's 3 different agencies involved here. So IF&W is the one that's most concerned about the deer, but they have no authority over the habitat and how it's managed directly, because they don't own it and they have no regulatory authority. So they work with the Land Use Planning Commission and DEP to work collaboratively on this issue. So these guidelines were developed by biologists based on their understanding of good winter shelter conditions for deer. So if we look at page 5, oh wait, nope, it's page 3 or 4. Sorry, with the one with the pictures on it. So we already talked about that they need to be softwood stands, and so softwood dominated is an important part of it. They need to be at least 35 feet tall. Looking at the stand that we're in, we're in a softwood stand, right? Is it more than 35 feet tall in terms of the canopy height? Based on all your work with clinometers now, would you say this is 35 feet or taller? Yes, definitely. All right, so in terms of softwood cover, it's not any softwoods. It's primarily cedar, hemlock, spruce fir, but not pine. Why not pine? Why is pine not considered appropriate winter shelter? It doesn't hold snow because of the needle structure and the habit of the crown of the tree. It's just not a very full crown, and the leaves are not flat and very full in order to capture snow. Pines are not good at capturing snow. So generally we would say that pine-dominated stands would not be appropriate winter shelter. All right, so we've got that. The other component of this is crown closure. And you'll see there's 2 different categories of winter shelter. There's primary and secondary. So primary winter shelter is where the crown closure is 70% or more of softwoods. So the softwoods have that much crown closure. For secondary winter shelter, boy, we've had every imaginable kind of noise out here today. Secondary winter shelter is 50 to 70% softwood canopy closure. So it's not as much. It tends to have more hardwoods mixed in with it. So we have a terminology issue here. So I'm talking about crown closure. There's also canopy cover, which some of you have probably heard of. And maybe you've heard of both of these terms. Does anybody know what the difference is? What's the difference between canopy cover and crown closure, or canopy closure? So closure versus cover.
Does cover refer to like how much shade is cast, and closure is how much the crown actually all
You're getting
comes
at it.
together
You're getting there.
and blocks?
Yeah, so I always like to think about this maybe from like a GIS, remote sensing type perspective, because you've probably, most of you have had GIS, right? So, and you probably worked with cover in that, like different types of like land cover, for example. What does cover refer to? It's a percentage of what? What was that? surface area. It's a percent of the surface area that something covers, right? So if you're thinking about trees, which obviously are three-dimensional, it'd be like, like that airplane that just flew over. It was kind of opportune, actually. And you were looking straight down, right? It'd be like, how much ground can you see, right? Or if you're on the ground looking up, it's how much sky can you see, right? It's pretty much straight up and down, right? So it's kind of taking it into a two-dimensional framework and thinking about exactly how much of the ground are we actually covering with softwoods. So crown closure, explain your crown closure again. You were kind of onto it.
Oh, I was saying instead of just crown closure, it would be more like how much the trees come together and meet and can actually block snow.
Yeah, so you've kind of got it. So with canopy cover, it's very much like straight up and down, right? It's like if we look straight up, how much sky do we see? And with crown closure, you're taking in the full view around you. You're looking at all the space that crowns are occupying. And you're looking at how much gap is there in between the crowns as you're looking around you. So whereas canopy cover is almost like a very cylindrical kind of look, it's straight up and down. Crown closure is almost more like a cone, right? Where you're standing is the narrow part of the cone and you're looking out broadly at the surrounding forest all the way around you. So at this spot where we're at, what do you think? So obviously they're two different terms. They don't mean the same thing. Often they're used interchangeably, I should say, which is a problem, right? If you're using them interchangeably, that's confusing because they are defined differently. You just define them. And so one issue that we've discovered with this, I'll tell you a little story here. So I study deer winter habitat, and we were trying to use LiDAR data. Does everybody know what LiDAR is? Light detection and ranging data. So, for example, there's a couple different ways of collecting it, but a common way is through aircraft. They fly over and they shoot photons down at the ground, and they look at how they return and the return rates, and that gives them a three-dimensional picture of not only the surface of the ground, but the forest. So you can create three-dimensional imagery of the surface of the earth as well as the forest cover, or whatever vegetation cover it is. So it gives you a point cloud, sort of like a three-dimensional point cloud of the world, so to speak. So what we were hoping to do is use that kind of data to describe winter habitat, because a lot of landowners are going to use that type of data set to manage their forests and understand their forests. So we were trying to do that, and so we were trying to take these guidelines and see if through LiDAR we could use that. So can we identify softwood cover? Can we identify the height of the canopy, which you can very easily do? The big one was crown closure, though. Like, how do you measure crown closure in a point cloud? And so we came up with a number of different ways of trying to measure that, as well as canopy cover. And so we came up with a bunch of metrics. And what we wanted to know is, how does this compare to what the biologists are assessing? So I just told you that in order to harvest in a deer wintering area, especially a zoned one, you need to have a biologist approve it, right? So there were two primary biologists in the state who reviewed those. It was the Western region biologist and the Northern region biologist. So those two people did most of the plan reviews for the whole state. So what we did was we created this data set at the Penobscot Experimental Forest. We brought these two experts who'd been doing this for over 30, 35 years of their career. And we sent them to the same plots. And we had them assess it and say, is this primary winter shelter? Is this secondary winter shelter? What percentage would you put on it? Is it 70%? Is it 50%? Is it 20%? We purposely created plots that covered a full range so that they were, covering everything. What we found out is that these two people that have been doing this their whole career were doing it differently. One person was doing canopy cover. He was looking straight up, only looking right above him. The other person was doing crown closure. He was looking at the whole forest around him in terms of how they were assessing this. So they had two very different processes that they were using two different terms, basically. And it was only then that they realized that for 30-some years they'd been doing it differently. Which is a little bit of a problem for the agency, because you can imagine landowners might be a little upset if they think one person's assessing one way and another person's assessing a different way. Anyway, question? They weren't doing any measurements at all. Not really. I was trying to. I was trying to come up with an objective way of classifying habitat, right? So that we could just do it broadly across really large areas using LiDAR and not have to send a person out to look at every acre of it to say, yeah, this is primary, this is secondary, this is something else. So a lot of times they did still agree on whether it was primary or secondary, but the way they got to it was through different assessment processes. So this was a bit of a shocker for their supervisor. And so they actually had meetings to try to decide how to deal with this moving forward. I mean, I think what they just need is just to have everybody trained together in the same way. Like, let's just all use the same process. But anyway, it's not my problem, but I was just the one to discover the problem. But anyway, so what we don't know is whether in this guideline it should be canopy cover or crown closure, because the people that created this no longer are around. So there's no one to ask what they meant. So we only know the terms that they used, but they never defined them. So we don't have definitions for the terminology, and so we don't really know what their intention was exactly when they created the guidelines. Nevertheless, the guidelines have not changed, even though they have been updated, but they've never been publicly released yet, to my knowledge. So, anyway, so based on crown closure, which is, we'll go with how it's stated here, what do you think about where we're standing? Is this primary winter shelter? Is this secondary winter shelter? If you had to put a number on it, what do you think? Secondary. Anybody vote primary? Like, what if we were over this way a little bit more? We'll do a show of hands. How many people think primary? How many people think secondary?
Go down the road.
Anybody not sure?
But if you see the red that's going off to the left.
I'd say it's a little bit marginal. Like right where we are, it looks a little bit more like secondary, but if you go a little bit more over this way, where the softwoods are denser and the crown's closed more, it's a little more like primary. So it's a little bit kind of on the line, a little bit here. Kind of on the cusp. Like right here, there's a little bit of blowdown in hardwoods, but you look over this way, and it's more solid softwoods. So it's a little bit of a combination. So far we've got the softwood cover, or softwood dominated, 35 feet, fairly high canopy closure. Area also matters. Typically we ask that deer wintering areas are at least 25 acres in size. Why does that matter? Why not just have a 1 acre deer yard? What was that? It's also not likely to be very protective, right?
Yeah.
You need a big enough area to block the wind and block the snow, and really small areas just don't really cut it. Plus you might have a bunch of deer, right? It's not just one deer. It's often 5, 10, 20 deer in some places that are using that same deer yard. So you need it to be big enough. All right, so we got the 25 acre minimum. It also has to be at least 1 chain wide. How long's a chain? Let's review. What was it?
60.
66 feet. Double that. So 66 feet. It has to be at least that wide. And why is that? So, I mean, again, it's sort of an area issue, right? You don't want it to be too narrow. And, oh, hey. We have a better late than never. Welcome.
Yeah, I went up, I came around, like, I didn't see anybody, like, at the main spot, so I went back down behind 90, I didn't see anybody there, so I just, like, wasn't sure what to do.
Well, you found us. Good job.
Eventually.
So we're talking about deer winter habitat right now. All right. So the chain width is important because you don't want the habitat to be too narrow. A lot of deer yards are narrow. Why is that? Anybody know why a lot of deer yards are long and narrow? It has to do with where they're often located.
Near roads?
Not a road. You're thinking linearly though. What was it?
Between highways?
Not necessarily between highways. Rivers, riparian zones, right? They're kind of down in valleys. They tend to be a little more shady, moister, cooler, where softwoods like to grow. So a lot of these deer yards are in these riparian zones. So they tend to be kind of more linear in shape. Not all of them are, but some of them are. So there's this minimum width requirement as a consequence of that. It also gets to the idea of corridors. The new kind of philosophy of deer winter yard management is not just to manage patches all over the place, but having them connected to one another so that deer can move across the landscape and stay in fairly good shelter over larger areas and have travel corridors that are more protected. There's something going on. Oh, it's a slug. I'm like, must be some sort of animal over there. All right. So corridors are important. So we've been talking primarily about shelter. What about browse? How does browse factor into this? So with secondary habitat, there's more hardwoods there. So sometimes there's more browse in secondary habitat. Where else will they go looking for food? Other than at people's backyards. Yeah, outside of the deer yard. So they'll go, so maybe there's a hardwood stand next to the deer yard. They'll go browse there. So the juxtaposition of different habitat components is really important. You don't have to have everything in the exact same spot, but having it in proximity to one another is good. So you don't need the shelter to necessarily be the good browse, but to have good browse nearby is also helpful. The other nice thing about hardwoods in the wintertime, what do deer like to do on nice sunny days? They bask. Yeah, especially if you have south-facing slopes and hardwoods, they'll go, and those places often are where the snow melts first too, right? So the deer will go and bask. That also helps them conserve energy, right? That helps them conserve that fat. If they can go and bask for part of the day, that helps keep them warm, and that's energy they're not expending. So they will try to bask. So having that kind of habitat nearby is really important. All right. So in terms of primary winter shelter and secondary winter shelter, what's more important? Actually, the recommendation is to have both together if you can, but is one more important than the other? If you had to choose.
Secondary because it also has browse.
Ah, but what happens with the really bad snowstorm?
They wouldn't have it.
They may not, but how often do we get the really bad snowstorms?
Maybe once a year.
Yeah,
maybe
not very
twice.
often. Like you might have one or two big events during the
One or
winter.
two, probably get shut
So
down.
it might be that you don't need that. So you may not need that primary very often. Actually, secondary is probably being used more of the winter because you don't need quite as much protection, but there's some food there. So in some ways, the secondary probably is the one that's a little more important. because the primary may not always be that important for them. And it might be you go a whole winter and you don't really need the primary winter shelter because you never really get a bad weather event. So it may not be as necessary. So in terms of regulations, the unorganized towns tend to be the ones where this is really a gray area. So if you have a DWA in an organized town, you'll find the polygon for it, and you can follow the guidelines, but it's not, nobody's gonna check you to see if you're cutting down too many trees or if your trees aren't, high enough percentage softwoods or anything like that. So they tend to be much more voluntary, and also it seems like the deer probably rely on them less so in that part of the state, right? Because most of the organized towns are in the southern part of the state where the climate is milder. So it just never has really been regulated, or there's no enforcement of anything. So it's really kind of this weird gray area in terms of what it means to be a deer wintering area in an organized town. Any questions about any of this? So we've talked a little about policy, we've talked about the actual ecological requirements, the actual biology of deer a little bit.
I have a question, so I spent quite a little bit of time on Acadia Mountains and Island. And I know that the huge national parks, there's no hunting there, but there's a huge deer population. How do they keep it from overpopulating?
They don't.
I live there, and I've seen the biggest deer in my entire life. The biggest antlers I've ever seen, ever.
It's called cars.
I don't know if they have any actual predators on the island.
Yeah, there's coyotes, so I'm sure, and they've got bears. They've got predators down there. What was that?
Not the whole island is part of the national park, so
Yeah.
maybe people do a little bit.
I'm sure people hunt outside the park.
There's a little
Absolutely.
bit of private hunting if you go further north or off Bar Harbor.
But deer are smart. Deer figure out where they're safe from hunters. So after opening day, they pretty much all head to places that they consider reserves. So I'm sure a lot of deer probably hightail it into the park and stay there until they feel like hunting season's over. I see that a lot back in the Midwest too. Like opening day, people are really successful, and after that, the deer go nocturnal, and they go hide in the places they know they're not getting shot at. Yeah. So there is, I'm sure, some hunting. There are predators. I'm sure people hit them with cars. I'm sure weather gets some of them, and some of them probably get sick, and so there's some natural control mechanisms there. But obviously, there's higher deer populations there because there's a lot of places where they can go where they're not hunted. So, yeah. And that's a common problem when you are trying to control deer populations, is when you have large areas that are not hunted, it's very hard to control deer populations through hunting. So, found that out with chronic wasting disease, trying to get deer densities down in chronic wasting disease areas. If those areas weren't completely open to hunting, there was no way to get the numbers down low enough to reduce transmission. So it's a real problem in some places, especially where you've got disease issues that you're trying to control. So my home state totally failed at that one. So it was not high graded. Oh my gosh! Don't tell Keith he high graded the site. Oh my gosh! No, it was not that. Actually, Charlie Koch was the one that laid this out. This was his first harvest plan that he laid out.
Oh, no. Sorry.
So we'll say no on the clear cut. What are our other systems? Is this a coppice? Nope. It is a type of shelter wood. Yes, we've got the right general category. Anybody remember what type of shelter wood there is? Because there's a whole bunch of them, right? There's a uniform shelter wood. There's an irregular shelter wood. There's a group shelter wood. And and under the irregular shelter wood, there's a whole bunch of different variations.
Probably one of those.
Does it look like it was cut in strips? There is a strip shelter wood, which is a form of group shelter wood.
No.
Now, it doesn't really look like strips to me.
Is it more of an irregular stand since there's some groups and some single trees, like the bigger
Yeah,
trees?
there you go. You got at it.
Which
So
are probably
irregular.
trees.
This is an irregular shelterwood. Does anybody remember what type of irregular shelterwood it was? We're standing next to something that's suggestive. There's a patch here, and there was a patch over there. There's a certain type of gap irregular shelterwood. We've got two different age classes in here.
No.
What was it? No, not quite. It's called an expanding gap shelterwood, because there were gaps here originally, right? The places with the good, these bigger, they're almost turning into saplings now, sapling-sized pines. Those were cut on a previous occasion. So that was the original gap. This is the new gap. So he kind of connected two prior gaps with one bigger gap. So this is an expanding gap irregular shelterwood. What makes it irregular? You kind of got at it.
That there's groups, but then there's also single trees left.
And what does that do to your age structure in this site as you think about, like if you had to graph this out, your diameter distribution curve that you saw on the exam yesterday?
Reverse J.
It might be kind of a reverse J. Is it going to be a smooth reverse J though? No, because you've got these clumps, these big clumps of all the same age trees, right? So it might be kind of a bumpy reverse J curve eventually. To start with, this was all even-aged though, if you remember. So it's becoming more uneven-aged as they cut gaps, right? So they're adding age class diversity here through time, so it's becoming uneven-aged. Now we do have 3 age classes. We've got these older trees, we've got these 2 older gaps, and now we've got this younger gap over here with younger trees. So we've got at least 3 age classes present now. So technically you could call it uneven aged in that regard, even though it's still a shelterwood, and you're still trying to create even age classes within the stand. You're still kind of following principles of shelterwood. But you have these reserves out here as well, which you pointed out, these kind of individual single trees. Who remembers what the objectives were for retaining these trees out here? There were more than one objective that they were trying to meet. And in a way, there were sort of 2 general types of trees out here that were meeting 2 different kind of types of objectives. Anybody remember? I can't hear you. John, what do you say?
Keeping cedar.
Oh, keeping cedar. So, yes, they were worried about whether they could regenerate it or not, right, because of the deer. So in terms of softwood preferences by deer, cedar is probably their #1 favorite food. What do you think is next? Was that? I'd say hemlock is probably next. White pine is probably kind of quite a ways down the list. But if a deer is hungry enough, it will eat anything. So it's not it kind of depends on deer densities, your local carrying capacity. There's a lot of things that factor into what their preferences are. But I'd say if any deer is hungry enough, they'll eat just about anything. There's no way to completely keep deer from eating things. I mean, if they're hungry enough, they'll start stripping the bark off the trees. So, and that's what they'll do in the winter. They'll do barking, you know, just another filler, right? Just another woody filler for them, fiber in their gut, even though it has very little caloric value to it or nutritional value. So we have cedar. They're retaining that mostly from a biodiversity perspective, right? Just to hold on to the species. So that's sort of one. So they kind of have these ecological objectives. So what else? Is there any other things out here that they may have kept for ecological purposes? Or habitat purposes, maybe? They left some snags. Yep, definitely. Yep. There might even be a tree or two around that they don't expect to live. What else? What other objectives are being met out here? We've got more silvicultural, economic type objectives as well. What might those be?
There's more deadwood left on the ground.
Yeah, there is deadwood left on the ground. That kind of goes along with the ecological side of things. What about more silvicultural reasons? What did they do here? What were they trying to regenerate? White pine. They left some white pine for what reason? Seed trees is one, and what was the other?
Shade.
Shade, because they're in shade intermediate, right? So they don't like full sun, but they don't like full shade. They need a little bit of shade. So they left them for both seed and for shade. Are they permanent reserves?
No, because it's a shelterwood system.
Yeah, so what they might do, so you have kind of two types of trees out here I was telling you about. One are permanent reserve trees like the cedar. The other set of trees are what we call growing stock. They're trees that we intend to cut at some point in time, but we're allowing them to either serve some immediate purpose with regeneration, or we're letting them grow bigger so that they are more valuable. So we might keep some of the smaller trees that we know if we let them grow another 5 or 6 inches, we'll get higher value out of them. We can get a better product from them. So they're growing stock trees. They're trees that we're just going to keep growing for a while longer. And maybe we come and take them the next time we come in and do the next set of gaps, right? So they'll probably expand the gap that way or that way next time they come in. And so they could take those trees at that time as well. All right. So how would you describe this particular gap? Like, what kind of characteristics could you attribute to it? Or what kinds of things could you measure about it? Like, what if I gave you a GPS unit? What kinds of things could you put into a GIS and measure? What's that? Size, area. What's the area of the gap? How big is it? That would be one thing. What else could we measure, say, in GIS? I'm having trouble hearing you over the truck, sorry. Okay. Think about it. Think about it a little bit. Go for it.
Could you characterize crown cover?
You could. I mean, you could say something about how open the gap is based on leaf trees that are out here. So you could say something about canopy cover within the gap or crown closure even. Yep, potentially. What else could you measure about this gap? We got size. What other characteristics do polygons have? What's that? Perimeter. What's the circumference? And what is the shape, right? You could have long, narrow gap, a very round gap. You could have a very convoluted gap with little fingers going off of it. So you can have very different shapes as well. What else? We had a slide about clear cuts early in the semester, and I said clear cut shape and something else was particularly important for your regeneration. Maybe Owen's onto it. Orientation, perfect, right? How much sun does your gap get, and do certain parts of it get more sun than others, right? So if you have some parts maybe on the southern side, because you've got tall trees there that are always shaded, and then you've got other parts maybe more up on the northern side of the gap that are in sun for more of the day. So that might affect your regeneration in the site, right? Because some places are getting more sun than others. So you have that issue. It also affects wildlife habitat characteristics as well, because you might have some differences, especially species that rely on sun to warm up. They might be found in certain parts of your gap more so than others. I definitely see that with nesting birds. Any idea what part of the gap they like to nest in? in terms of orientation? What part? Think about it. If you have eggs and baby birds you're trying to keep warm. What was that?
North to south.
So it's often in the spots where you get sun first thing in the morning. So it tends to not be on the east side. It tends to be more on the west side of the site because you're getting shade cast on the east side. So they tend to nest in the places that get early sun because when's the coldest part of the day? It's right around daybreak, right? That's your coldest part of the day. So they want to warm up as fast as possible when you've got baby birds, and their growth is dependent on staying warm. So anyway, so I see patterns like that in gaps, especially the bigger gaps, right, where there's differential sunlight throughout it. So how would you describe this for wildlife? What wildlife would you expect to find out here? What was that?
Woodpeckers?
Woodpeckers? Sure, there's some snags, probably some dying trees that they might go after insects or put cavities in. So foraging and cavity trees for woodpeckers. What else? Deer. We definitely saw evidence of deer. What was our evidence of deer out here? What was that?
We saw a deer last time
We saw a deer for one. What's our other major clue out here? There's scat and also the browse on the red maples. Like there's some red maples that are never going to be above deer height because they've either been killed already or they just keep getting browsed back down. I mean, you can look at some of these clumps out here. In some cases there's some of the red maple stems have gotten tall enough, but others are just like shrubs. They're just permanent deer shrubs. So yes, deer. What else? Deer and woodpeckers. Got to be something else out here.
Hares?
Hares? Maybe. Maybe once there's more covered. This might be a little vulnerable as a hare out here right now. What else is out here? See a lot of dead wood on the ground. That might help something. What was that?
Small mammals.
Small mammals. Yeah, lots of good small mammal cover out here. There's rubus. There's soft mast out here as food resources. What other kind of birds might be out here? Something more than woodpeckers, I'm sure.
Chickadees.
We did see chickadees on our way in. Songbirds. What kind of nesting species might you find out here? Ground nesters, yeah. So birds that nest on the ground or that might nest in small shrubs. Like some of these, like I look in there and I'm like, oh yeah, I could see a robin nesting in there. Or you look at places like, actually where there's this dense grass, I could see like song sparrows or stuff nesting in there, white-throated sparrows in some of these spots. I mean, there's pretty good ground cover in here for ground nesters. Whippoorwills? There are whippoorwills around. I would say they like hardwoods better. They like sandier soils than what we have here. So this is not a great area for whippoorwills. But I'd say in places that are sandier and that have like more oak-dominated sites. So like if you go more south in Maine where you get more pine oak type communities, that tends to be where you have better whippoorwill habitat. What about woodcock?
Oh yeah.
That's the twirly one, right?
The twirly one, yeah, exactly. You got it. The spring twirls, yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, do you think you could see woodcock out here in the spring displaying maybe? I could possibly see that. I could see a male out here. I mean, it's really open right now. I could see a male displaying out here. Yeah, so that's possible. Grouse, possibly grouse. Maybe as it gets a little bit older. Grouse like get really dense and they like sapling to pole-sized trees. So it might not be great now, but I'd say give it another 15, 20 years and it'll be probably pretty good for grouse out here. Any other thoughts? What else likes a lot of sun? Likes to bask in the sun, in fact. Herbs, especially like snakes, right, that are ectotherms that need to gain heat from the environment. So these kind of openings are really good for snakes. We've got a rare snake in the state for which we do much larger openings than this. Anybody know what our rare snake is? Our conservation priority snake. Actually, IF&W does a bunch of management for this species. And they try to keep things open like this, open and brushy, but much bigger. Black racers is the species. Yep, we do have black racers. Not right here, but further south in the state.
Snake I've ever seen is a garter snake.
I've only seen garter snakes.
Oh, is that?
I've only seen garter snakes, milk snakes, and a green snake.
Yeah, I'd say the garter snakes are most common. I do see green snakes.
I've seen green,
I
yep.
see red-bellied snakes, and once in a while I'll see a ring neck snake, which looks a lot like a red-bellied snake, except with a little ring.
Like to hang out up in the cracks up on the cliffs.
Okay, yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a milk snake here.
They'll be up on cliffs, and then you put your hand in the cracks, and there's just a snake.
Okay.
Or you see their skins like in the cracks, like
Yeah,
spots
yep,
on
yep.
them. How they're-
Definitely. Yeah, it's amazing how without any appendages they can grip onto things.
I want a snake.
Yep. Yep, so these kinds of sunny open areas are good for snakes. Probably not as good for frogs and salamanders. Why would it be not as good for? It's drier. You've got it's more open, it's sunnier, it's warmer, you have those environmental extremes, right? So this is tougher for frogs and salamanders to get across unless there's water in wet depressions, which this is, there's obviously a little bit of water here because we've got some marsh grasses here. And if we go back to the next opening, you might remember there are cattails back there. So it might be that this is wet enough that they can make it through. As long as they can find little microhabitats that are moist, they can make it across openings. But it's definitely riskier and more problematic. But all right, let's go ahead to the next gap. We're gonna go next one. We've got a couple more gaps to look at, and then we'll start heading down. Characterize this gap relative to the last one. What's different about this one? A lot more open. More open, so there's fewer trees these days. I don't know, on a per acre basis, do you think it's changed? It might be about the same, but what's different about this generation?
Less than time.
Yeah, so it's a smaller gap. Our retained tree density might be similar, even though it seems like it's fewer, but it's also a smaller gap. Regeneration isn't as good in here. The rubus was really dense, so some of the composition and structure is a little bit different. What else did you say? I got most of it, I think. Well, one thing we don't have is the original gaps, right? This was the first time this gap was created, where back there it was expanded. So this wasn't an expansion. The next time they come in, they'll expand this. So we don't have those nice patches of regeneration kind of around that we had over there. In terms of shape, what do you think? It's more, sort of oval. It's maybe, that seems slightly more convoluted to me than this one.
This is less irregular.
Yeah.
Less irregular in shape. What do you think about sun and orientation here?
Probably a lot of shade, but it's smaller.
Probably has a little more shade. I mean, it's still got all these softwoods around it. Like right now, I mean, the sun is still up quite a ways, but the softwoods are totally blocking the sunlight at this point. So there's some differences here. So how would that affect, say, wildlife? What might be different about wildlife in this gap? Did you expect anything different here? Yep, so animals that like to bask may not be as common in here. Mentioned the nesting, like there might be fewer birds nesting in here because there might be fewer areas that have sun in the morning. It kind of depends on the orientation. Just thinking about where the sun would be. Be kind of over there. So, yeah, I mean, there is a little bit of a gap. There's probably some areas that'll have sun in the morning. Just not a lot. It's not oriented terribly. I don't know. It's got sort of a north-south orientation. So this part up here might get sun much of the day. It's always interesting to think about, like, well, how your sun changes, right, through the day. Other thoughts?
It looks like there's a lot more raspberry over here than in the last one.
Yeah, there's a lot of browse here. In fact, I can't remember if it was this lab or the other lab where we saw deer in here.
There were deer. There was one on the way in today.
Oh, okay. Okay. And there was a deer over here, I think, for the other lab. And actually, we had 2 deer in here when we got here on Wednesday. They went this way, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, there were deer back in here when we arrived on Wednesday. And actually, there were tracks all over the place. They've been all over these gaps. All right, we're gonna head that way. So, take whatever route is easiest for you to get over there. There's a lot of down.
Get over there?
Perfect.
Yay!
Perfect. Fuzzy.
I see more cedar, maybe?
Or what?
Cedar?
Cedar?
Just kidding.
Hemlock?
Hemlock, probably. Yeah, there's definitely more hemlock.
Fine.
There is some spruce. There is still a little white pine in here, but yeah, I'd say the composition's changed a little bit. What else might be a little different? The red stuff?
Fungus.
The British, like they're British soldiers.
That one looks even. That one's the best.
These little British soldiers.
Yeah.
I think that's what those are.
That's what they're called.
It's a like type of lichen.
That was good. I appreciate
Let's
it.
see.
It's easy to remember because they do kind of look like British soldiers, like back, when they wear the big red fuzzy hats, right? I guess the Imperial Guard or whatever still do that, but for show.
Is this standard for staff?
So what other indicators are that we're in a different stand?
Is it white pine tree?
Yeah. So
There's more white pine regeneration.
there is
less
white pine
raspberry.
regeneration. What's different about the regeneration?
It's older.
It's older. Awesome. Thank you. So this tells me this was cut at a different time than that was cut as well. The gap is smaller, right? And actually, if you took out your phone and opened up Google Earth and looked at this, you would see that there's a bunch of big gaps over there and a bunch of little gaps over here. So this was a whole different harvest plan in terms of gaps on this side of the line, which kind of goes north-south, but very close, I think, to that creek, actually. So how else would you describe this gap in terms of how it's different? So we said it's smaller, the regeneration's older. What else is different?
It's not as open.
Not as open, probably more shade. We're to the point, so the first gap we were in, what would you call the area? Or how many tree heights was it across?
2 or 3.
2 or 3 tree heights, maybe an acreage, half an acre, maybe. What would you say about this gap? What was that?
Quarter of an acre.
Quarter acre or even smaller. What about tree heights? How many tree heights is it? maybe one, I'd say. And maybe if you went the absolute longest point, it might be like 1.5. So it's definitely smaller, so you're gonna have more shade in here. What else is different? Anything else that's compositionally or structurally different?
Like 1 or 2 trees that are reserved other than snags.
Yeah, so, and we have a smaller area now to reserve in, so you're to the point where maybe you'd only keep 1 or 2 trees in the gap. Yeah. What else structurally, compositionally is different?
You have a lot less woody material.
Yeah, I'd say there's less downwood in here. I mean, there still is some, but it's really the coarse stuff now.
Yeah.
Which also tells me something about when this was harvested, right? Because the small stuff's decomposed,
Yeah.
right? So we're getting down to the bigger stuff that's left. You can also look at stump ages as well. But so there's less dead wood, at least the finer dead wood. What else is different about the understory in here? Does it look different at all, other than the...
Like less unwanted
I don't know,
vegetation.
not that
Ferns,
much.
there weren't really any ferns in the last area.
Yeah, so maybe the herbaceous vegetation is different compositionally. I don't see cattails. I don't see a ton of rubus. There's a little bit, like it looks like maybe there's a little bit over there.
Is it a little bit drier?
Maybe a little drier, could be, you know, so that's why we don't have cattails and marsh grass so much.
I was gonna say weather, like, but I don't know. This is like a puddle, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say this whole forest is a little bit wet depending on conditions, so I bet in the spring this looks kind of wet. There's moss in here, right, suggesting that at least during snow melt, there's probably some, it's pretty wet. So yeah, so there's some
Still pretty wet
differences.
right
What about wildlife? How would our wildlife change in this size gap?
Doesn't look like there's as much grazing.
What was that?
Or, doesn't look like there's as much, deer grazing.
Oh, deer browse?
Grazing.
Deer browsing, yep.
There could be one.
I'm out of
There's a
there.
lot of
Or
vegetation
maybe
there.
there was deer browsing, but they've eaten it. Like this all looks like it's been browsed over and over and over again. So the hardwoods, the deer are doing the softwood management here. They're removing the hardwood competition. So you might normally have used an herbicide in here, but the deer are actually doing them a favor. The deer are keeping the hardwoods in check. You can see there's a bunch of little hardwoods in here. They're really struggling to get above deer height though. So the deer are removing the competition because they'd rather eat the hardwoods than they would the pine. So so that's going on. What about birds? How might birds be different in here?
There's definitely a lot less sunlight, I feel like, in this direction.
Yep, so maybe we have different types of birds that would use this?
Smaller as well, so I feel like even, like we talked about over there, maybe one side gets a little bit of sun, but here,
It
feel
might
like
be
it's
pretty shaded.
yeah, like the trees on
Most
the
of the
side
time.
are gonna, I feel like this is gonna have a lot less attention.
Yeah. So let's think about woodcock. Would we have displaying woodcock in here?
I would probably think color.
Probably not. If I were the socially dominant woodcock in the area, I think I'd go pick the first big gap. This would be the low woodcock on the totem pole might be trying to display over here. So definitely not as good. Not as good of a display area. It's not as open. The females can't see you over here. So yeah, so I would say less attractive from that perspective. Would it be more attractive to some other birds though? Yes. Good answer. Yes. There are some birds that like small gaps, actually. If it were regenerating better with hardwoods in here, species like chestnut-sided warblers like little gaps. A lot of our, there's different feeding strategies that birds have, right? Some are ground foragers, some are bark foragers, some glean insects off of leaves. Some are aerial insectivores and hunt entirely on the wing. And then there's others that like hawk or fly out from a perch, grab an insect, fly back, like flycatchers. It's a fly catching behavior. They sit on a branch, they fly out, catch an insect, fly back. You probably all watched them do that. They like openings for that. So you often watch them in situations like this, or on like edges of lake shores, or edges of fields, or your yard, or whatnot, because they like to see the insects. So they fly out, grab an insect, fly back. So for those kinds of birds, they really like these kinds of gaps. It gives them protection, but at the same time they can see and feed out in these little open areas. Same for bats as well. You'll see bats flying around in gaps as well, feeding as well. I think it's easier for them to echolocate insects out in the open. But and you know, we could probably go on and on. Like there might be fewer snakes in here, but maybe there's more wood frogs because it's more shady. You know, and it's by water here that they might take advantage of. I don't think there's any vernal pools nearby, but I'm sure there still are frogs moving through here. Any other thoughts on this gap? All right, we're gonna head out to this trail that you've all observed, and we're gonna go this way. All right.
I love this stuff.
You can look at these heavily browsed poor little hardwoods.
It's like thick.
Looks like aspen.
My mom loves pink.
I will rule out clear cut and conservatory. That group in the name that we recently talked about.
Group Shelterwood?
Could be a group shelterwood. That's a possibility. If I had to lean towards one or the other, or if you had to lean towards one or the other, what might you lean towards at this point, based on what you see? Are you trying to impede seed dispersal?
Yes.
I mean, I'm kind of assisting.
Or you're assisting? Oh, you're an agent.
We'll come back next.
You're an
That's
agent.
not
Let's call
assisting.
you an agent then. Okay.
Is it wind dispersal?
It's sort of a combined method here. Oh, I see. We're going to see if we can make cattails grow in this gap. All right, so if you had to lean towards group selection or group shelterwood, any thoughts on this?
I'd say group selection.
I'd say group selection, especially because there really isn't. The way that this is being regenerated, I don't see that there's really necessarily been a shelterwood. I don't know that I see evidence of that necessarily. I don't know. It could be.
I'm just looking at stumps. It
It's
seems
possible.
like there's a class of very degraded stumps and a class of not so degraded, which
So,
could just be a function of
it
what
could
type
be.
of wood it is, or it could be.
Yeah, I think it's possible that it's either.
Yeah.
We wouldn't know for sure unless we, I think, watched another entry
Right.
or asked the forester what their intent
That's
was.
really how you find out what
That's
what
really
happened.
how you find out what happened. But you can always kind of look at the evidence, right? There's always evidence there. And like John was saying, he was looking at stumps to try and decipher what's going on. You know, that's one way to do it. So, and also looking at what's left, does it look like there were a series of entries? You know, what do you think happened here? You know, sometimes you have that history, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you buy a property and it comes with no management history that you know of. So you're left kind of trying to guess what you think the prior landowner was trying to accomplish and with what methods. So, all right, let's head to the trail. Story if we weren't all wearing masks. Swear to God. Why?
How do you get to the back of the grid to do that?
Yeah, probably.
We can't bring them all tomorrow. Get them all out of here.
They used to call it New Jersey. You call these things pumps. And what you do is you grab them off the side of the highway, little drainage pieces, and you pull them off, come like some rock. That's what's like the 10-year-old hooligans in New Jersey. That's what my dad.
Very Jersey childhood athlete.
to vote for primary? We could do a show of hands. How many people think primary? A couple people. How many people think secondary? Looking at behind me here. Need votes for secondary. How many people are still deciding? How many people think it's neither? Maybe. Those are your 4 options. So let's start over. I'll give you another moment to think about it. I think only about a third of the class voted.
So what are the options, Amber?
Primary shelter, secondary shelter, neither, or undecided. We'll give you an undecided option. Okay, so let's, new show of hands. You got to pick an option. You got to raise your hand for one. Primary. Few people. Secondary. Got about equal number. How many think it's neither? One at all. Okay, we got a couple that think neither. And then who's just totally undecided yet? Okay, so we've had most people commit one way or another. So let's look at it. So relative to the first site we were at, do we have more or less hardwood? More. I'd say more hardwood. And we thought that was sort of borderline primary, secondary. So when you've got more hardwoods, I'd say it's more gaps up here. So I would be leaning towards, what do you think? More like secondary. I'd say there's enough softwood in here that I would call it some level winter shelter. I would say that that's not so little that I wouldn't call it not shelter. So I'd lean towards secondary. Okay, onward. But it's the wrong shape of the gap. Yeah, they don't all need to be perfectly round or ovals or whatnot. They can be more convoluted in places. What else can we vary up?
How much dead woods or snags are retained?
Yeah, we can vary up what we retain, right? What structures we retain, what legacies we want in our gap. Yep, got that. Anything else we can vary? How can we vary up our sunlight? Orientation. So we don't need to orient everything the same way. Which is a limitation, say, like with strip shelter woods, for example. They tend to always be oriented the same way. So, you know, some silvicultural methods are less flexible in that regard. So what type of silvicultural systems might you use to create gap diversity? This is a summary of what we already talked about. So what regeneration methods might we use?
Irregular shelter wood.
Could use a regular shelter wood. We could use
Group selection.
Group selection. Could do group shelter wood. What else? How would we create the smaller gaps?
Selection.
What kind?
Like the selective
Single tree selection. Awesome. Yeah. So we can also create really small gaps with single tree selection. So we can use our full toolbox of regeneration methods to create diversity across the forest, and depending on what you also want to regenerate. But you might want to regenerate a diversity of tree species too. We talked about, you know, even from a marketability perspective, you never know what your future market's going to be. So by managing for tree diversity, you're giving yourself more options economically as well in the long run. So managing for diversity in a lot of different ways is something to think about, especially when you're managing larger land areas. So, John, anything else you want to add that I didn't cover? I would also say in this kind of management, the art of silviculture really comes into play a lot. There's nothing, you know, there's a lot of straightforward prescriptions you can follow, and sometimes foresters get very overly prescriptive, like they just do the same thing over and over again. But I'd say there's a lot of opportunities to look at each stand and think about what might I do a little bit differently. So that's part of where the art of silviculture comes in, is looking at a stand, seeing what your opportunities are, maybe tweaking your prescriptions one way or another, or to favor something, or knowing that you're going to have trouble regenerating cedar here, but maybe you wouldn't have trouble doing that in another place. You make a little different decisions. So context is always very important. So there's the science side. You know, we know how to regenerate a white pine. but there's some art to it in terms of especially thinking about ecological forestry as we think about how you might go about prescribing a harvest. So, all right, anything else?
I would just say, kind of, just to add on, the university forest is nice because they have a lot of flexibility in what they do. So you see some harvesting methods that aren't super common. Like, you know, your small landowner might not be able to sustainably do a single tree selection harvest, but they can do it here. So take a look at it, see what it looks like, kind of get familiar with it.
Yeah.
And then did you talk about the size of deer yards? I forget.
We
I
said
just
at
can't
least
remember.
25 acres.
Okay.
Yep.
That was the only thing
Yep.
that I thought you gave me.
Yeah, going back to what you said, one of the objectives of the university forest is research. So there's always these opportunities to try new things, you know, before you go out and start recommending them broadly, right? So you can actually try some things out because it's a little bit of an experimental forest as well, much like the Penobscot experimental forest is. They have a lot of experiments that they're doing, you know, playing around with these different silvicultural systems. This is where the first expanding gap irregular shelterwood in the U.S. was created, was on the Penobscot experimental forest, and now there's one on the university forest as well, and then there's more now that have spread all across the continent. So it's a place to like try out new things, right? So, and we're fed up with our hard hats.
Yeah. No, I think he's fed up with me.
Oh, he's fed up with you. What do you mean a pest?
It's the hard hat.
So anyway, so I just want you to think about that there isn't necessarily one way to do everything. So there's not always one right way either. I mean, there's a lot of different options that are perfectly acceptable depending on what you're trying to do. So, all right, I think we're good. Wow.
That was interesting.
Maybe that deer survived.
We gotta cut down the population here.
Yeah, right.
You think that
Yeah,
farm over there?
what was that?
You all know on College Ave the farm or like the house that has the field?
Oh,
I know
yeah.
exactly
Yeah, the
where
deer-
are they feeding their deer?
No, I won't
Oh
get one.
jeez.
Yeah, that's a reliable spot to see deer there.
Are they feeding them though?
I think they're just feeding in that field. I don't know that they're purposely feeding them,
I
but
don't think
well,
they
I think
are.
you would see more if they were
purposely
feeding.
I
But they're
mean,
always there.
There's always
I
I used to live in
comes to
Beasley,
my
there's always an
backyard,
albino deer